Thank you very much. Welcome to the second panel. I don't have to scream anymore. We have some panelists that were not in the first session, and for the sake of simplicity, I will just ask them to, for those of you who don't know them, superstars, to introduce themselves. Maybe starting with Kristen.
Hi, for those of you who don't know me, I'm Kristen Fortney, co-founder and CEO of BioAge, a company developing therapies to treat diseases of aging.
Oh, okay.
Is this good?
Yeah.
No?
Okay.
Was that
Matt, maybe you would like to go next.
Sure. Is this on? Matt Kaberlein. Matt Kaberlein. I am the Chief Science Officer of Optispan Geroscience and a Professor of Laboratory Medicine and Pathology at the University of Washington.
Thank you so much. Eric?
Hello, everybody. I was about to say good morning because I just got off the plane coming from San Francisco, so that's how it feels. But I'm Eric Verdin. I'm the president and CEO of the Buck Institute for Research on Aging and a faculty member with an active lab at the Buck.
Thank you so much. Here.
So my name is Jörg Gold, and I'm the director of the Institute for Translational Medicine, ETH Zurich, heavily involved in digital biomarkers.
Thank you so much. And we have a guest on Zoom, Dr. Paul Rubin. Would you like to briefly introduce yourself? And thank you for joining.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here via the internet. My name is Paul Rubin. I'm a physician, clinical pharmacologist. I've been in academia and mostly in the industry, both biotech and pharma, for a little more than 30 years. I've been involved with discovery, development of multiple drugs, multiple mechanisms, multiple indications, taking them through discovery all the way through approval. And I've been involved with probably more than a dozen compounds that are now on the market.
All right, thank you so much. We would love to kick off the discussion.
Hello. Yeah, so this second panel is longevity medicine therapeutics, applied geroprotective intervention, drug repurposing and discovery, and RCT. That's a lot, and we have a lot of panelists. I wonder if one of you could start perhaps by drafting a kind of landscape of where we stand in terms of in the clinic, what type of compounds, what type of mechanisms are currently entering clinical trials, and then maybe we can delve into some of the more specific ones. So who wants to take this?
Jim Kirkland?
Maybe we can also add to this question. As physicians, we always have the first domain: do no harm, right? And being a little bit provocative here, most of our patients or enthusiasts are now getting the geroprotectors or senolytics, I'm just throwing this into the room right now, off-label, right? With a prescription, somewhere through other means. What do you think, where are we in terms of bringing it into a reasonable clinical setting versus minimizing the risk and doing no harm? John?
So I love this question because I feel so passionately that we shouldn't be using drugs in humans off-label. We really need to do placebo-controlled trials to show the risk-benefit and show anything that's modifying biology is going to have a side effect. And we really have to show that those side effects are outweighed by the benefit. I think there's a lot of drugs that we're moving forward and a lot of targets into these placebo-controlled clinical trials. Jim talked about some. Everybody here is doing some, and I think it's essential for the field to get that database.
Thank you so much. A lot of people are very, very focused right now also on the NAD boosters and NAD boosters, right? Where do we stand in that domain in terms of clinical setting?
Can you hear with my
yes,
mic?
Yes.
So very early days, and I think this is one point that I think we should all really reflect upon. I know that Matt is here on the stage with me, and I've heard him, say to Peter Attia and agree with Peter Attia that the NAD boosters are not promising, or that anyway. And I think I agree with them. There's no demonstrated efficacy in human, except for a small clinical trial that showed a marginal effect on glucose intolerance. And I think we should all be, taking this with a pause and saying, the reason why we got so excited about NAD boosters, NR and NMN, is the preclinical data in animal models is actually doing amazing things. And, I might not believe everything that's in the literature, but I tell you, I'll believe what's happening in my lab. And in many respects, what these NMN and NR are doing is pretty remarkable. So, again, we're confronted, and this is general for the whole field, with the translation of preclinical models into the clinic in humans. And I completely agree with Joan that, we know sales of metformin are up 20% right now in the last few years because of the promise in the TAME trial. But again, this is not a clinical trial. This is no demonstrated evidence. So I think we should all, as a field, really, there's no shortcut to doing these clinical trials. If you look at what's happened with omega fatty acids and vitamin D, I would say this would be sort of a good forewarning of what we have in front of us in terms of the difficulty to actually implement these therapies, especially when we're going to be dealing with people who are healthy. So, I went to medical school and I was told, first do no harm. So I think, I thought you were hearing me very well. Anyway, and I've said, I think, great exciting time, really the beginning of this field. And I think my personal view is caution, and let's see the data.
So I just want to say there are two drugs that we have to look at them a little bit differently. First of all, metformin, all the clinical studies have been done. Whether it's mortality, prevention of diabetes, cancer hasn't been done, but it's been done.
But in diabetics?
No, not in diabetic. First of all, the DPPP was not diabetic. MCI was not diabetic, right? The mortality was against not diabetic. I don't think metformin is a strong anti-diabetic. I think it's a strong anti-aging, but that doesn't matter. The studies have been done in this population. The same is for SGLT2, which is also anti-diabetic, but in New England Journal, there's people without diabetes that are benefiting from that. And both of them are not probably from a glucose perspective. So how do we use those two examples to make them relevant even faster, because clinical trials have been done? I would say this is a challenge that we can promote a little bit ahead of NAD, of rapamycin, of all those other things.
Can I jump in? First of all, I want to defend myself a little bit. I think what I said when I was on Peter's podcast was not that I don't believe at all in NAD or NAD precursors. It's that the literature to me is extremely uneven. There's a lot of smoke and no fire yet. So I think we just don't know at this point. And I agree completely, well, not completely, mostly with what Joan said. We absolutely need these randomized controlled clinical trials. I very much have become of the opinion that it is appropriate to use these things off-label, and that physicians can make a decision when off-label use of metformin, rapamycin, is appropriate for their patients. And I'll just tell you, I've seen a lot of data from people who are using rapamycin off-label, and I personally believe that it works really well for some people, not for everyone. We need the clinical trials. We absolutely need to know what the risk-benefit actually is. But I can tell you, there is a risk to not doing anything, and it's going to take a long time, I believe, to do these very large clinical trials.
I just want to chime in here because I think I completely agree, but I think that we have to remember too that drugs like metformin, it doesn't work. Yeah, so agreeing, but I just want to chime in that drugs like metformin, like SGLT2 and rapamycin, these are like three special cases in the sense that yes, like we know because they've been given to upwards of millions of people over a long period of time, what the full side effect profile will be, what the risks will be, so we can go there. But what about the next generation of geroprotectors? And I know all of us are really bringing forward some of those newer therapies. And it's important to keep in mind that, in BioAge or insilico or, Tornado brings a therapy forward, it's an aging mechanism, but it's going to be approved for a disease first. And an off-label is going to be off the table for a while, right? There's been some debate earlier today, is aging a disease, is it not a disease? And whether it is or it isn't, the reality of clinical development today is that you still have to start there. And I think, a question that I'm interested in is for, first of all, let's get those metformins, to the broadest population as quickly as possible, but then how do we accelerate that broader adoption of sort of the next generation gerotherapeutics?
So just to respond to Matt, in the placebo-controlled trials we do, the placebo effect is astonishing. And this may get to what Alex was saying, that if you believe you're not aging, I don't know whether it's mind over body or it's just you're in fantasy land, but we see so many health benefits reported in people on placebo. So I just don't know, without that placebo, if you can even know what the real efficacy is. And we really need to get that data to make smart decisions as longevity medicine practitioners.
Can I add on this? I want to make a strong point for some new biomarkers, especially some digital biomarkers. And it was clearly said in a previous session, we should also look what patients want. And typically patients want to stay independent, want to be mobile, want to be physically active. And with now some new digital biomarkers, we can measure it in their own life, remotely, in decentralized trials. And there we can overcome the placebo effect, because what you say is what people think they can do and not what they do. We know that it's a great disconnect between the patient-reported outcome and what they in reality do. And we have a great chance to utilize some novel technology to follow them through their own life and to see whether we have really an effect or everything is gone as a placebo effect.
So just to add to this, and also a disclaimer, so it's not from insilico medicine, just want to disconnect myself from the company, because we're running 31 therapeutic programs that are in part targeting aging and disease at the same time, and some are very classical therapeutics. So having said that, I think that it's very important to think about your life as a venture capitalist. We actually discussed that a lot with Eva, and might actually even think about a paper on that. So with venture capital, think about it as money. So the time that you have is money, and if you don't invest it, inflation is gonna eat it, right? Right now everybody is talking about inflation. So very often venture capitalists have to invest in assets that have certain risk and return properties. And in some cases the return is very significant, but also the risk is very significant. And in some cases, the return is even not known. It might just beat the inflation barely, but the risk is very small. So I think with those therapeutics that we're discussing currently, with metformin, the risk is very small. With rapamycin, the risk is likely to be small as well. With NAD boosters, the risk is very small. As a matter of fact, with NAD boosters, currently NMN, you can buy NMN in pretty much every large store in China. So it's such a huge consumer of NMN, it's become part of the culture. David Sinclair is, he's never promoting, just to make a disclaimer, he's not promoting nutraceuticals, he is a very credible scientist, but in China, he is a hero who brought NMN to the market, or who invented it. So they promote him. So I think that many people need to just understand this risk and return fundamental, and in some cases you might want to go with safer therapeutics already, as long as you measure all the biomarkers all the time. So I don't think we should be preventing people from experimenting on themselves, because otherwise we're preventing people from taking a possible risk hedge against the certain inflation which is aging. So if you think about time is money, That's the strategy we have to take. With some more hardcore therapeutics, then you will need to really think, right? Because the safety profile is not exactly established. But with things that have been out there for ages, I don't think we should prevent people from doing that and ask for clean experiments. For that, we have Morten Scheibe-Knudsen, who is writing, who is currently running an R study, right? Clinical study. So we need to get clinical data. And ITP data, I think all the ITP data showed that NMN is not working in life extension, right, in mice. But there is some physiology. I take it. Anybody else take it?
Can I expand on that a little bit? I'm sorry.
Please,
Hello?
please, Paul, yes, go ahead. Thank you.
Yeah. I think you're raising a good point, and you have to keep in mind that the existing therapies have been around in some cases for 60 years. The real issue is from a clinical and regulatory perspective to develop novel mechanisms and novel compounds. You're talking about trying to do clinical trials to prophylax against aging. So you're talking about trials that are completely impractical from both a time and from a money commitment. They're impossible, as a matter of fact, at this stage.
No. That's
Hold on, let me just finish. From a regulatory perspective.
That's in fact not true. Okay,
Yeah.
so think of the
Well, it is true. Let me just finish, and then we'll let you continue.
So think of the TAME trial.
Why don't you let him finish first?
Yeah, sorry. I shouldn't have given the microphone.
You shoved the microphone.
I'm sorry. Am I allowed to finish the statement, or
Yeah. I apologize.
It's my fault. I handed him the microphone.
Okay, we've been involved with multiple conversations with regulatory agencies, and yes, where it might be physically possible to do this, you're after determining a trial that's adequately powered that for highly variable endpoints. So from a regulatory perspective, it's very, very difficult to do. And what I wanted to say was that probably a more practical way to do this is to start with tractable indications that are related ultimately to aging, where you can look at validated endpoints for diseases that are not necessarily prophylactic in nature. If they are, then the disease has a rapid course that you can actually get an effect in a time period that's reasonable, or you're trying to correct an existing disease where the time commitment is not quite the same. Once they're on the market and they have safety data, then that's a lot easier then to go into these age-related long-term clinical trials. And that's what I wanted to say. You have to keep in mind what the regulatory restraints are in terms of power and time. Thank you.
First of all, I agree with what you said. I was speaking on one sentence. Look, we all agree that in order to treat a disease, you have to do this disease. And if it's cardiovascular disease, you need 15,000 people in your trial, right? The TAME is 3,000 people in the trial. And you know why that is? Because we cluster together cardiovascular disease, cancer, dementia and decline, and mortality. So you take people 65 to 80, they have more of all of those together. If I needed to do that on their own, I had to have 20,000 people. But that's an example where if you have something that really target aging, in fact, 3,000 people is important because we don't want to stop the study because it's only cardiovascular. We want to show that we don't care what disease you get the point and we get statistical significance. So in my view, if you think of that, then when we have real gerotherapeutics, it's going to be easier to do this study with many less people.
I'd like to make two additional points. One is there are no drugs without side effects. And as we decide to give drugs to people who are aging, healthily or not healthily, I think we'll always have to mitigate the risk versus the reward. And I'll give you an example for metformin suppresses testosterone. And so when you're speaking to someone who's 25-year-old or 35-year-old who asks, should I take metformin, you can show him the numbers of your testosterone is going to go down, and in some cases dramatically. So that's an example, not to lifestyle on metformin. I think
Well,
it's
not to
great.
give metformin to 25 years old.
But even the 45-year-old, that has to be balanced. The second thing is, I think we're spending a lot of time talking about drugs, which I think we all recognize are the promise of what's going to happen in the future. But I hope that as an organization, as a meeting, we're not only going to focus on drugs, because we have anti-aging interventions today. 93% of your longevity determines on your lifestyle, and your lifestyle is predominantly your nutrition, your sleep, your stress level, and your physical activity. And I think we know, we've done some calculation that predict that most people could expect to live to 90 to 95 in good health if they were optimized in terms of these lifestyle intervention. And I feel that as a field, we have a responsibility to bring this to the fore. This would already, everybody talks about longevity, dividend of what would happen if we get an extra year or 2 years of life. We have the tools to do this, and as societies, we fail to deliver this. So to me, there's an incredible need that our field should really address head on, while we continue working in the background on developing these magic drugs.
So I want to go back to the clinical trials, but I agree with you completely, Eric, about the lifestyle interventions. The challenge I see is actually how do we get people to adopt it? And I'm not sure that in fact, I'm pretty sure we're not going to solve that, but there's lots of opportunity there. I also make this point, and people get all upset with me, but exercise, I would say, is the biggest component of lifestyle. And exercise has a lot of side effects associated with it. So when we think about drugs versus lifestyle, it's useful to think about what are the side effects associated with exercise. Anyways, I want to go back to the clinical trials, because Nir presented one sort of model for a clinical trial for aging in the form of TAME. I think it's really important. But the thing I don't often hear about are people thinking about alternative endpoints that aren't necessarily the diseases that are usually looked at in clinical trials that might be easier from a gerotherapeutic perspective. And a couple that have caught my attention recently, mostly because I know of small clinical trials with rapamycin that the Impetus Grants program is actually funding. One is for oral health, so gingivitis and periodontal disease. We don't think a lot about oral health, but it's really important for health span. And those are really easy, non-invasive endpoints to look at in a clinical trial. So it's actually a relatively cheap clinical trial. And we know, again, at least in mice, that rapamycin can reverse periodontal disease, reverse gingivitis. Another is a premature ovarian failure in women who are undergoing early ovarian failure. Again, I think that's an opportunity where the biology of aging intersects really nicely with that phenotype. There may be opportunities from a clinical perspective to show efficacy where you could actually get FDA approval either for periodontal disease or for ovarian failure. So I think thinking more about those kinds of, a little bit less traditional, I guess, endpoints for clinical trials, there might be some real value there.
I think that's exactly the way you have to approach it, is just as you suggest, is those are very tractable and are already validated. And then you could expand from there. And there are others exactly like that. And I think that's the easiest way, also from a regulatory perspective, to go forward.
And I think we can take some advantage from other fields. As you know, there are some established human pain models where you can test pain drugs on top of a surgical intervention like toe correction. So we have already established those human models where you have very controlled environment and can test your substance, your drug, and have a nice endpoint. And I just want to expand this. I witnessed the rise and the fall of bone biology. I started in genetic fractures some years ago. And I mean, it was a golden time where pharma was heavily investing at that time because, prescribing drugs for 20 years is like printing money. However, the society failed to come up with new endpoints. So still the reduction of fractures is the only accepted endpoint for a couple of years and now against gold standard. And this led to a situation where these trials became bigger and bigger because you have now to test drugs against established drugs. And so the whole field, failed finally, and pharma pulled out because the society was unable to establish new endpoints. I think we should not repeat the same mistake. And I really urge the society to do the job, to come up with endpoints, established endpoints and biomarkers. Otherwise, we will see the same in this field. And here again, other societies have done a good job, like rheumatology and others who did a great job, and you can see if they establish the endpoint, the indication and the guideline, then they keep the field alive and they keep the traction for the investors.
Just a curiosity, the biphosphonates that were the main drugs to treat osteoporosis, they elongate, they increase longevity in animal model, but more important, in clinical and association study, they have decreased mortality even in women in ICU. And the British government is supporting a TAME-like study ID to test biphosphonate now. So bones are back to aging.
I'll go fast. I think what we're all talking about are stepping stone indications, which I know James talks a lot about at Cambrian, where you can take these interventions targeting aging biology, and Matt, you're bringing these up too, test them in a small indication, which doesn't cost a lot of money and time, and then broaden later. And I think that's an approach a lot of us take.
Yeah, that's what you presented.
So I'll just very quickly deviate and kind of coming back to NMN and other products that are available right now. So if people take them and actually they kind of act as venture capitalists of themselves, they also learn a little bit more about the field. So I think it's extremely important to educate the physicians. We were talking about longevity medicine education. It's also important to educate the patients. So if they are taking anything, they should be tracking biomarkers. But actually, I also want to deviate into another area and shamelessly promote BioAge and Kristen's work, because right now she is taking the samurai approach and is bringing 3 clinical stage products, phase 2, through clinical trials. And I would really like to ask you, how are you tracking the efficacy in aging? Because of course they're all purposed towards a disease. It's a traditional paradigm. Actually, slightly disagree with some statements that you don't need to, forget about disease, because you need to. You won't be able to raise a substantial round of funding and also partner with a pharma company if you don't have a pathway towards, a disease market. So how are you doing this?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I'm actually really interested in speaking with other companies. We have been speaking with some other companies because you're bringing your intervention forward, you think it's for an aging target, but that first indication really is just a disease or an age-related condition, right? So how do you actually know that it's broader beyond that? And I think we should all work together on standards for that. At BioAge thus far, we've been using proteomics. We're big fans of SomaLogic. I know some of you guys have worked with them as well. They measure 7,000 proteins in human blood. And they have huge biobanks across the world, and they have very predictive, subsets of the proteome for muscle health and aging and immune health and aging. And I think they're a great starting place to try to see, like, is this drug not only impacting the disease, but is it having some fundamental impact on aging? Where we can, we also like to include wearables because they're very easy. But what else can we do that is sort of fairly low cost, to sort of learn more about the broader potential of our indications? Because as we've all been discussing, right, that this stepping stone approach has existed for a long time, like with statins, for example, right? But the indication expansion took 20 years. So how can we work together to sort of enable that to go faster? It's something I'm very interested in, yeah.
I want to be the third party to validate your aging biomarker work. Yeah.
And can I make a plug for one more type of clinical trial, which is a veterinary clinical trial? I think some people in this field are starting to think about this. You may not know this, but the FDA, at least in the United States, regulates drugs for veterinary use the same way they regulate drugs for human use. It's the Center for Veterinary Medicine. I think because companion animals age, if they're dogs, 7 to 10 times faster than people do, there are real opportunities there to get approval for use of a drug to target the biology of aging, where you could actually get aging or lifespan as the endpoint. And so people are just starting to think about this a little bit more in this field. The infrastructure to actually do that isn't there. I think that's a problem, but it's solvable. But I think this is a place where we could actually have drugs approved for aging, recognized by the general public that they modify the biology of aging and that there's real clinical evidence to support that. So I'm just gonna, put that out there and hopefully get more people thinking about that. And people love their companion dogs and cats, and that's a big deal.
Get a hamster.
Some people love their companion hamster and fish and snakes, and I'm sorry if I'm leaving out your favorite companion animal. But they all age.
Methuselah Zoo.
Right. Thank you so much. We were also wondering what would be the intersection of the geroprotectors and allergies, the therapeutic intervention that we like to think about them as the pharmacologons, with the lifestyle intervention or other interventions, right? So we have the emerging of really high level of engineering solutions right now, robotics, etc., not only for diagnostics, but also for interventions. Would you like to comment on that? How do you see the development of the new therapeutics going together with, as basic lifestyle intervention, maybe monitored in a more enhanced way, exercise and others, versus the engineering ones, new technologies? Nir?
Yeah, I'm not diabetic, and I had this, I don't know, it's not working through here. My glucose is 96 now. My glucose is 96 now. And why I'm doing it, it's total curiosity, which happens to a lot of our patients, right? I want to know, I want to understand better about myself. I started everything with pre-diabetic, that went away with metformin, but I'm discovering like really interesting things. For example, when I exercise, my glucose goes up. Mm-hmm. Now, we kind of knew, I'm a diabetologist, so I kind of know that some people need less insulin or need to eat when they exercise and some not, but when you exercise, your glucose your liver produces glucose and your muscle takes glucose, but they're not well coordinated. So sometimes it'll go up and sometimes it'll go down. I'm just giving this example because this technology makes you know about yourself and make yourself monitor things. So I think those are very powerful technologies. By the way, I'm doing it when I'm traveling because in jet lag, my basal glucose goes high a lot, and so I'm kind of looking what I can do about it. But it's all curiosity. My hemoglobin A1C is fine.
Yes.
So I just want to amplify the point I was making about lifestyle. And it was said that this is very difficult. As societies, I think we have miserably failed at implementing these interventions or these changes, which I think, in my opinion, doesn't mean that we've done everything that we could. And I'll just bring the example of smoking. Back in 1990, 25 to 30% of the population was smoking, and following sort of massive and aggressive campaigns of information of the public, I think we're down, 15%, and I think in California less than 10%. So I want to emphasize the point that I think any intervention should be layered on the base of a optimized lifestyle, because frankly, as I said earlier, most of these interventions that we look at will come with some side effects. And so first, optimizing lifestyle intervention, and second, adding the drugs on top. Another point I want to make related to this is I think the way we do research in some way favors a set of drugs which are healing mice that are living in the most unhealthy environment. They're unable to exercise. They are confined in a small space. Like quite often, they are alone. Think about the health span of a human that you would put under the condition: ad-lib food, nothing to do. In some way, I think I worry sometimes that these artificially toxic environments might be actually biasing the drugs that we identify as prolonging lifespan or health span towards a whole set of mechanisms which might not apply to the rest of people.
Right. Thank you so much. Yes?
Just to add on this, I would hope that we would combine intervention, as you say. I would hope that we can combine interventions, as you say. A couple of years ago I was involved in some sarcopenia drugs, and we could nicely show that we can grow muscle, but we didn't add any function to this because people were not training, they were not exercising. I don't agree with your statement about the side effects of exercise.
You've never had a sore muscle?
And then we combined it, and I did a nice intervention study with both of them, and then it worked, So I would expect that we would combine a lifestyle intervention with, supporting, pharmaceutical intervention, and then you have typically not only an additive effect, but a much bigger synergy effect. And again, here we might utilize all the technology that we have around, for incentivizing, for measuring, for self-adjusting, and we can see some effects there. And we simply have to adjust it to our population in need. It has to be easy to use, not with a lot of complicated guidelines, very intuitive, and also easy to monitor, so that we can include it in decentralized trials or in a disease monitoring.
So I want to maybe take a little bit of a contrarian view on the combining or optimizing lifestyle and then putting drugs on top of that, which is not that I disagree conceptually with that point, but I think we need to, this is why we really, really need validated biomarkers that are actually predictive for biological aging, because I think, and I know this is true in laboratory conditions, that when you combine a bunch of different things, more often than not, you go the other direction. And so I would be a little worried about optimizing your lifestyle and then taking metformin and taking rapamycin and taking NMN and taking 8 different supplements, right? If you don't have a way to know whether you're actually getting any added benefit from all of that stuff, I personally would be kind of nervous about that sort of combination.
I agree, and look, as I said, I'm a diabetologist. When I tell diabetic patients to lose weight in the Bronx, by the way, if I tell diabetic patients to lose weight and exercise, how many of them are doing that? 3% in our clinic, okay? Now, the poor people, like the people in the Bronx, are the people that needs more help because they die 20 years before the people who go to those special institutes, right, and pay a lot of money. So I asked Andrew Scott, right? Andrew Scott is an economist, right, that showed that longevity dividend is amazing. Also showed in the paper that if we do the TAME trial, the value that we had is $150 million when the study cost $50 million. Like we're going to make $100 million only in TAME, 3,000 people, 1,500 people actually. So I came to him and I said, okay, so the poor people, okay, let's see what's the cost effect of metformin versus exercise or diet. So in order to give them diet, you have to bring diet. You have to bring fresh vegetables and fruit. You have to convert them to fish. They might not like it. You might need to do education around that, but it's costly. We did it with cigarettes. People stopped smoking cigarettes, but it's a cost. You can get them to exercise, but you have to either allow them to build to buy machines, or you have to build gyms. And he calculated roughly that it's $1 of metformin per $100,000 of environmental intervention. In other words, we have to think.
How about walking?
Well, I provoke.
30 minutes a day of walking reduces all-cause mortality by 40% over 10 years. Walking. And I think, how many people know this in general?
I totally agree, and I'll tell you in the Bronx they are not walking either, but I totally agree, and I meant to be provocative just to make the point that it's possible that gerotherapeutics is a help to people who cannot interact with the environment because they're not us.
I have a point there too. You brought up sarcopenia, and that's an indication that we're very interested in too. And what you said is exactly right. Like, I think that in that context, it might not suffice to just change one thing with a gerotherapeutic. When you're looking at a population that's already old, it's already quite late, really, in the progression of life, and they're very frail, then you can't possibly hope to see something on its own, and you might need there to be like a rehab, an exercise procedure that you add a therapy on top of. We've looked at these indications because really, in some ways, you'd like to get the drug to the people who need it the most, the quickest as possible, right? Which are not younger people or people with a very narrow kind of disease, but actually an older population. But then if you're going into people where, all these different things are going wrong, is it going to be enough of a lever to see an effect all by itself? Yeah,
and just to answer to your question, I don't want to have a wild combination of everything that helps. We want to combine things where we know that they add to each other, that they are synergistic, where we have physiological evidence that the combination of the 2 or max 3 things may help. So just to clarify this a little bit, and I fully agree, and there was also the idea of developing a sarcopenia drug, because sometimes patients in bed, hospital, bedridden, they can't exercise as young people would do it, and you would take away this and substitute this with a pharmaceutical, basically. But anyway, we want to bring them back to a healthy lifestyle, and even if the drug would be cheaper, I would bet on a long-term run, a healthy lifestyle is much cheaper. But I see the point you make, and you want to be provocative, but so we should think about useful combinations of interventions, let's say a lifestyle intervention combined with one drug intervention, where we know that they are most effective in a combination. I think it would be my approach, and I fully agree, as a society, you should really think about a whole spectrum of interventions, how to promote them and how to get them across.
Thank you so much. We will take some questions from the audience. I'm sure there are many or more. Thank you for your help.
I wanted to sort of amplify what you all guys were saying and kind of sort of give you a little bit different perspective. So when we talk about extending longevity or health span or any of those endpoints, to Kristen's point, when people have, 75 plus, they have sarcopenia, you're probably not going to do much. But what about people who are healthy, but so they don't have comorbidities, but they have loss of function? Women have frozen shoulders, which I can tell you severely disables your ability to exercise, and therefore you start on decline. So what about things like that are functionally impairing, but are not sarcopenia, and stuff like that? And so that's sort of one thing. And I get the point about regulatory agencies, but regulatory agencies draw the expertise from the experts. Regulatory agencies can be, they don't have their own expertise, right? They draw it from the experts. Think of TAME trial. They can be educated. And so that's one point. And then the second thing is, so I worked in sort of diseases for a long time before we start working on aging. And to me, one interesting thing that distinguishes studies on diseases and aging is we don't have advocates. We don't have patient advocates. If you think of any cancer, however rare, any genetic disorder, there are advocates. They're vocal, they're engaged, they educate the society, they educate the physicians, they drive regulatory agencies to adopt patient-reported outcomes. We don't have that. And I think that's where people taking things off-label can create that, because they see those benefits. They're, so it creates the wave, but then, to Jim's point, I mean, we have 400 aging representatives who are holding the purse. What's going to make them want to do more? You know what I mean? So I think that's sort of just trying to think outside the box. Adopt from other fields, but try to think outside the box and move things to where we want to go, not just where, regulators let us. And I'm not sort of advocating, unsafe trials, but it's just because something cannot be done now, it doesn't mean it cannot be done.
So I think, and you sort of alluded to this, that these functional conditions are opportunities for off-label use where we might actually be able to do even small clinical trials, certainly case reports. And you mentioned frozen shoulder. I know you know this, Natalia, but if any of you have listened to the podcast that I did with Tim Ferriss, I shared that I had adhesive capsulitis, which is frozen shoulder. I couldn't do this 3 years ago. I took rapamycin and I cured it. Now, it could be placebo effect, but it was so painful and so debilitating that I really don't believe that it was. And I shared that on this podcast. And since then, I've had, probably dozens of people reach out to me, either orthopedic surgeons who treat frozen shoulder or patients, and obviously I don't tell them take rapamycin, but I think if some of these physicians learn of these reports, and it's a personal case report, that can have an effect. And maybe somebody will do a small clinical trial with rapamycin, and maybe we'll learn that indeed, in 80% of people with frozen shoulder, they see a positive outcome. So that may be a path, right? And maybe I'm wrong, but I don't think you're ever going to get big pharma to do a big clinical trial for frozen shoulder. Certainly not with a drug like rapamycin that's off patent.
Marco Quarta from Rubedo. So I think the path that we are all taking, right, is initially targeting age-related diseases as an entry point, where there are established markers, or at least endpoints, and clinical trial is clear, with the idea that can open up across multiple follow-up future therapeutic interventions. But as we are talking here, we're thinking ahead of what is a truly longevity therapeutic, like a TAME trial is an example. But to enable success of the field, I think there are lots of challenges that we're thinking about. How can we include patients and how we can define aging? You mentioned, well, we can have multiple comorbidities, consider multiple comorbidities. But I think we're still thinking as the biological aging as one bucket. So maybe there is different trajectory. But the truth is there is divergence, and actually people age differently. So there are actually different biological aging populations. So how can we stratify patients as we think about a real trial that takes into account the aging process? How do we solve this? So if we want to de-risk clinical development and really enable success that can support the whole field, because otherwise we risk to do a step back.
So I'll let you guys talk in just a minute, because I've been talking a lot. And I agree with you. There are absolutely individual trajectories of aging. I would say there are some things that seem to work for pretty much everybody. And I think we've talked about exercise, and nutritional interventions are a little bit more challenging. But so I think it's going to be a mix, right? I think there will be some interventions that pretty much work across the board. And then, of course, there are going to be things that are going to be more effective for some people than for other people. And my sort of naive, simple answer is that's why we need biomarkers that are validated and reflect biological aging at the individual level. That, to me, is the only way I think we get personalized geroscience.
And I would add that we have a paper in a high-profile journal in review with Tony Weiss-Corey. We're doing proteomics, where we identified biomarkers according to where they come from, which organ they come from. So the idea is that, yes, one of your organs is going to lead your aging maybe, and maybe we can do this biomarker, and maybe there's be a drug that will be better for you than for this cause than others. But I think this is all going to develop. It's going to develop in parallel, as Jim and I say, it's and actually my sister is the one who started to tell me everything. I said, shall I do this or this? No, you do this and that. So we do everything in parallel, but I do think that aging itself can be start to be targeted now, and will get the finesse with time.
Conceptually, you could also think about the same than in babies, where we have these percentiles and you monitor growth, whether they are at the right time point when they grow. You could think about the same in the other direction, about decline, where you are still in the kind of trajectory of your decline, or you're already an outlier that you decline earlier or later. And I really like the concept of resilience. If you could detect, we would have better tests of resilience, and we could earlier detect whether people are going to become frail or really at an early time point. So we would need these early markers, but for this we would need longitudinal studies, to see, is this really predictive of a frail status at a later stage? And if you would come up with this, this could also serve as a proxy for studies at a later stage. So if we do altogether more research about this, we may come to this and say, okay, we have those kind of percentiles of decline, and we have these early markers of resilience to predict later frailty.
So yeah, just to add to that, I think that it's very nice that I am currently in phase 1, not in phase 2, but Kristen is in phase 2. So we will always be able to learn from Kristen in the next year or so. That's why I want to highlight BioAge one more time. And I think what they did is, going with SomaLogic, large protein array, it's probably the best thing to do, because you can still operate within the realm of credible pharmaceutical industry. Many of the big pharma companies use this data type in standard clinical trials to get more insights from the clinical trial. And in addition, you just have additional endpoints that you can use internally, not exactly for aging. I'm not sure if you're not running it for aging, right now?
Oh, not really, no.
Yeah, right, see? And from that, we would be able to learn. And I don't think that, stratifying by age trajectories at this point in time is exactly something that we need to do. I think we first need to see drugs in the clinic that could be, in theory, repurposed. If you've identified the drug using an aging clock and then tested using an aging clock and it worked, that's a really cool starting point. After that, we can use that data to analyze and try to look at individual aging rates. Do you have anything to add, Kristen?
Oh,
Can
no,
I add something,
just
Kristen?
Yeah.
Yeah, let me just say, so I want to emphasize what people have been saying. Obviously, to determine biomarkers is the answer. And I think one of the things we've been able to do at BioAge, really because of our unique samples, is to look at pre-morbid biomarkers, where we do proteomics analyses prior to them developing the diseases associated with aging and determine if it's predictive of what actually occurs. This has allowed us to find not only targets to repurpose drugs, as we said before, to discover new drugs, but also to find who will respond best to modulation of these targets. So I think exactly right. The answer to this, because people age at different rates chronologically, is to determine, is there an aging proteomics phenotype?
One very quick joke.
And then,
jokes are not funny.
Yeah.
I don't know. Go ahead.
Well, because of my cultural origin, my jokes are not funny. But actually, one really cool biomarker that nobody is tracking properly is how old do you feel? Subjective age. I wonder if we can actually ask the patients in the phase 2 clinical trial this question. Can we?
Are you feeling better? Yeah. I'm just going to be super brief, but just to emphasize what Paul said, I mean, we actually have like longitudinal somologic proteomics from people over 50 years of aging. So from that, we've built these predictors of all-cause mortality and lifespan, and we're going to be able to look at those same predictors in the context of our trials. Yeah.
There's actually a lot of data existing on a concept called subjective health, which is a 10-question questionnaire that you can ask people. It's one of the strongest predictor of lifespan. Along, probably even better than the epigenetics clock. It's just how healthy do you think you are?
We just published a study on that too. Yeah.
Really? It's not like super noisy?
It is not super noisy, and you can predict all-cause mortality much better than any other clock. Subjective age is like, we use 50 questions.
It's a great tool. So, still not, yes, thank you so much. Paul, you wanted to add something? Sorry.
No, I think I was able to say what I wished to say.
All right, we can take one more question. Yeah.
Yeah, hello, Mustafa Kassem. I'm a clinical endocrinologist from Denmark. I have been exposed to the dark side of longevity medicine because we are currently receiving an increasing number of relatively young people or middle-aged people that feel not functioning properly. And with extensive investigation as clinical endocrinologists, we don't find really clearly defined conditions. But these guys, they have been exposed to the longevity sphere. And in close examination and interviewing, they have been doing actually exactly like some of you have just mentioned, experimenting with themselves with multiple drugs, multiple approaches, being inspired by some of the interviews and some of the N=1 experiment. So the question to you, do you think that we may need to develop some sort of clinical trials dealing with this problem? Because actually it's an increasing problem, and as a clinician working in a publicly funded hospitals, we don't have clear answers for these people, and they leave the hospital extremely unsatisfied.
So first
That's
of
a great
all,
question.
if they're using those drugs, that means you're prescribing that to them, no? They get it otherwise?
Off-label.
Okay, look,
Off-label.
I think it's very important and Eva, you can second that, this Longevity Medical Society, you saw that 3 of the people are Jim, Tom Rando, and myself, because we went to medical school, so we know to do no harm. The second day of medicine is there's no always and there's no never. So you're conservative and you have no self-confidence, basically, from medical school. And people in the FDA just went to the first day of medical school, so they don't allow any drugs in. So I think the point is, this is exciting time, and we don't want to kill anyone on our way to success. So I think it pays for us as leaders to be more conservative and to just listen and see what's going on and what's the traits. Look, young people are in our graduate school at Einstein, which is a good and big graduate school, half of the people go to aging lab, to geroscience lab. It's really something that young people are much more interested than in our time. So it's really good times, but I'm calling just to be careful, because we need this success rapid and we don't want a setback.
Yeah, and I would just add to that. I mean, I think that looking at the biohacker crowd is probably not a great sampling of the sort of overall population. So it certainly seems plausible to me that and I guess I would put myself in that category, given that I just told you all that I've taken rapamycin. But I don't know that we can really say there may be psychological consequences, I would say, of being associated with trying to take all of these different things, along with the biological consequences of taking. A lot of these people take 20 different things, right? So I guess I'm just saying I don't know how much. I don't know that I would really believe there's a causal association between any one thing they might be taking and what you described. And I think it's good to be aware of, but this is going to continue to become more and more mainstream. Like, I think the cat's out of the bag. This is happening. I agree with Nir. We want to do clinical trials. We want to do it right. We want to have responsible people like Nir leading the charge. But this is coming, and so I think it's, I think we're just going to all have to be more aware of those kinds of things and pay attention as physicians on the ground start to report back what they're seeing.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I couldn't agree more. Thank you to all the panelists. I'm so sorry we need to cut. I blame it on Martin in a good way. Thank you so much to all the panelists. They will be around during the conference.